No early father develops the theology of Christian marriage more than the doctor of grace. Although St. Augustine obviously calls matrimony a sacrament, it must be clarified if he uses the term in the strict sense, as he does with baptism and ordination, or merely in the broad sense, like he does with the sign of the cross or even the Nicene Creed. The significance of this question is evident, for although sufficient evidence for the sacramentality of marriage can certainly be gathered from other testimonies of tradition, such an argument loses weight if it is deprived of the authority of such great a doctor. Ultimately, St. Augustine does not explicitly say that matrimony confers grace like he does for baptism. However, his doctrine of matrimony contains such a conclusion implicitly. For St. Augustine teaches that the sacraments of the new law surpass those of the old law in that they confer grace as opposed to merely signifying it. Commenting on Psalm 72, he writes, quote, "The sacraments are not the same because some sacraments give salvation, while others promise the Savior. The sacraments of the New Testament give salvation. The sacraments of the Old Testament promise the Savior." End quote. St. Augustine also limits the sacramentality of marriage in some proper sense and its sanctity to those in the Church, teaching that it is a sign of a holy thing. Although St. Augustine attributes the name sacrament to marriage among non-Christians, he is very clear that it is only a sacrament in a very unique sense in the Church. It's also important to note that modern Catholic theologians also call non-Christian marriages a sacrament in the broad sense, like a sacrament of nature. This can be found primarily, though not only, in two texts of St. Augustine, namely De Bono Conjugale, on the good of marriage, and De Nuptiis et Concupiscentia, on marriage and concupiscence. In these texts, the Bishop of Hippo first explicitly calls Christian marriage a sacrament, as in a sacred sign of the union between Christ and the Church, in contrast to non-Christian marriages. This is seen in On the Good of Marriage, chapter 21, and on Marriage and Concupiscence, chapter 11, where he consistently refers to marriage as the sacramentum nuptiarum, or the sacrament of marriage. However, one must clarify what St. Augustine meant by sacrament. In his writings, marriage is a sacrament properly speaking only among Christians, and this is because of its indissolubility. And on Marriage and Concupiscence, he writes regarding Christian marriages, quote, "It is certainly not fecundity only, the fruit of which consists of offspring, nor chastity only, whose bond is fidelity, but also a certain sacramental bond in marriage, which is recommended to believers in wedlock. Accordingly, it is enjoined by the apostle, saying, 'Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church.'" End quote. He says on Faith and Good Works, chapter 7, 10, quote, "Therefore, let it not be the case that we grieve in a manner that is clearly not human, but utterly vain, when wrongdoings are corrected, as if marriages were dissolved, especially in the city of our God, on his holy mountain, that is, in the church, where the bond of marriage is not only commended, but also the sacrament, in such a way that it is not permitted for a man to give his wife to another." End quote. Second, St. Augustine grants the sacrament of marriage a certain sanctity pertaining to the supernatural order. He writes, quote, "Therefore, the good of marriage for all nations and all people lies in the cause of procreation and in the faith of chastity. But that which pertains to the people of God is also in the sanctity of the sacrament, by which it is wrong even for one who has been divorced to marry another while her husband lives, and not even for the sole cause of procreation." End quote. He then adds that regarding the sanctity of the sacrament, St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7, 10-11, that if a Christian couple separates, they cannot remarry. Discussing the strength of matrimony's indissolubility, he writes in On the Good of Marriage, chapter 7, quote, "I do not think this bond could have been so strong unless it were some sacrament of a greater matter, introduced due to the frailty of human mortality, which would remain unshaken for those who abandon their partners and desire to dissolve it, serving as a punishment for them." End quote. Here, St. Augustine affirms that marriage among Christians is not only a sign of the union of Christ and the Church, but that this meaning was imparted by God himself, in order to uphold its indissolubility. This is very different from the typical Protestant position that holds even Christian marriage as a secular institution, despite granting a certain holiness to it. For St. Augustine, it is clear that adultery would not only constitute sin, but also sacrilege, the profanation of a sacred thing. Third, St. Augustine compares marriage to baptism and ordination. For St. Augustine, the effect of matrimony among Christians was an indissoluble bond among the spouses, akin but not the same as the sacramental character imprinted by baptism and ordination. He writes, quote, "In like manner, as if there take place an ordination of clergy in order to form a congregation of people, although the congregation of people follow not, yet there remains in the ordained persons the sacrament of ordination. And if, for any fault, any be removed from his office, he will not be without the sacrament of the Lord, once for all set upon him, albeit continuing unto condemnation." End quote. He further writes in On Marriage and Concupiscence, chapter 10, quote, "In like manner, the soul of an apostate which renounces as it were its marriage union with Christ, does not, even though it has cast away its faith, lose the sacrament of its faith, which it received in the laver of regeneration. It would undoubtedly be given back to him if he were to return, although he lost it on his departure from Christ. He retains, however, the sacrament after his apostasy, to the aggravation of his punishment, not for meriting the reward." End quote. Here, it's important to know that although St. Augustine never explicitly writes about the grace as an effect, it does not therefore follow that he denied such a thing, for when he compares matrimony to baptism, he uses the baptismal character in his example and does not speak about the grace of baptism. It is thus evident that St. Augustine's concern was not to defend the grace of matrimony, but the goodness and indissolubility of the sacrament in his two highly polemical works against the Manichaeans. Finally, St. Augustine implicitly teaches that the sacrament of matrimony contains grace. First, and on the good of widowhood, chapter 8, he writes, quote, "Therefore the good of marriage is always good, but among the people of God it was once an observance of the law. Now it is a remedy for infirmity, and in some cases a consolation for humanity. Indeed, to be engaged in the begetting of children, not after the fashion of dogs by promiscuous use of females, but by honest order of marriage, is not an affection such as we are to blame in a man. Yet this affection itself, the Christian mind, having thoughts of heavenly things, in a more praiseworthy manner surpasses and overcomes." End quote. Similar language can be found in On the Literal Sense of Genesis, Book 9, Chapter 7. Second, St. Augustine also affirms the strengthening of marriage in the New Law, commenting on John 2 and the wedding feast at Cana, as did many other fathers. He writes, quote, "And for this cause, therefore, did the Lord, on being invited, come to the marriage, to strengthen conjugal chastity, and to show forth the sacrament of marriage. For the bridegroom in that marriage, to whom it was said, 'You have kept the good wine until now,' represented the person of the Lord. For the good wine, namely the gospel, Christ has kept until now." End quote. If you would like to see a scriptural and biblical argument for the sacrament of matrimony, please see a previous video I have uploaded in my channel. Make sure to subscribe, like, share this video with others, and stay tuned for similar content on the sacraments and other things regarding Catholic theology. Thank you, and God bless you.